With the Taliban back in control, foreign nations are now scrambling to get their citizens out, and the Afghans who worked with them out of the country, of course. And the situation at the Kabul airport as of now remains tense. Gunshots were fired into the air near crowds of people outside the airport on Wednesday. Videos of the incident showed crowds running away from the armed Taliban member firing his gun in the air. The US is looking to get thousands of its citizens out of the country before the August 31st deadline. President Biden has said that troops will remain in Afghanistan till all evacuations are complete. Thousands of US soldiers are at the Kabul airport, and the Pentagon now plans to ramp up flights of its huge C-17 transport jets to as many as 24 a day.
Americans should understand that troops might have to be there beyond August 31st.
No, Americans should understand that we're going to try to get it done before August 31st.
But if we don't, the troops will stay.
If we don't, we'll determine at the time who's left.
And
if there are American forces, if there's American citizens left, we're going to stay till we get them all out.
Meanwhile, the first Dutch evacuation flight reportedly left Kabul without a single Dutch national on board after passengers were blocked by US troops. Foreign Minister said that the Americans gave the plane 30 minutes on the tarmac before ordering it to leave, despite Dutch officials pleading to the US for more time. But the Netherlands did manage to evacuate its first nationals on Wednesday, with 35 on board a plane headed for Georgian capital, Tbilisi. Most people who sought refuge in the French embassy in Kabul are now out of the country. The French army's plane carrying 25 French nationals and 184 Afghans from civil society in need of protection arrived in Paris on Wednesday evening. Many of those on board were women and children. Meanwhile, President Emmanuel Macron tweeted that nearly 200 Afghans who work for France or were under threat have now been evacuated, along with French and other nationals. Also on board were Dutch nationals, an Irishman and 2 Kenyans. Britain has so far flown out more than 300 nationals and more than 2,000 Afghans. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that the UK officials were working around the clock to keep the exit doors open. An international agency reported that India's diplomats needed a Taliban armed escort to the airport, taking 5 hours to make the 5-kilometer journey from the embassy. India had been a staunch ally of the ousted Afghan government, so nerves were jangling among the 150 nationals and diplomats gathered at the now-closed mission. But at the first of nearly 24 vehicles drove out of the embassy late on Monday, some of the heavily armed Taliban fighters waved and smiled at the passengers. And according to reports, India has so far already evacuated around 150 Indian nationals, including embassy staff, diplomats and media members. Our principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhant Sibal now joins us live for more details. Siddhant, thanks for joining us. What can you tell us about the situation at Kabul airport? We understand that Indian nationals were escorted with an armed Taliban guard. What is the status of the evacuation of Indians as of now?
Well, when it comes to these reports of Indian diplomats being escorted by armed Taliban guards, this is not correct. This is something that is something being reported by Western media agencies. But right now we need to understand what's happening in Kabul. Kabul does not have any governance right now. You can't just call anyone and say that we're leaving to the airport and we would like to have an escort. So there is no single point person, whether it's the former government or whether it's the Taliban as well. When it comes to the evacuation of the Indian diplomats, it was a very complex process in which, yes, the Americans were involved, the Tajiks were involved in terms of the Indian plane being given the landing permission and giving the parking space as well at the Aini Air Base in Tajikistan. But the trip that was the most complex was from the embassy till the airport, and this entire movement of the Indian convoy was basically helped by the Indian the locals, the local Afghans working at the Indian embassy in Kabul. These local Afghans who are well spoken in local languages like Dari and Pashto were able to negotiate in terms of the 15 posts that were to be crossed. The biggest fear was that these 15 posts manned by Taliban might have been infiltrated by Pakistani terror groups like LET, something WION had broken yesterday,
Right.
and that was the biggest fear. So while the negotiations happened between these local contacts and these checkpoints at the entire city, the biggest thing was to make sure that there is a safe movement of the Indian convoy. And finally, the evacuation happened, and we know that the Indian diplomats, the Indian envoy, and other people who were brought are here in India right now.
Right, Siddhant, let's talk about the American stand as of now. President Biden seems to have gone on the back foot, saying that American forces will stay on in Afghanistan till all Americans are out. What can you tell us about this?
Well, if you look at the situation right now, it is a no governance area, not only just Kabul, but also Afghanistan. The only way one can come out of the country is through the Kabul International Airport. And that is right now in the control of the Americans. So Americans are keen that more and more American lives can be saved. These Americans can be flown out, but just not the Americans, but also the Afghan interpreters who help the Americans, also the citizens, the nationals and the diplomats of foreign countries. It is now well known that how the Indian side and the US side had coordinated for the landing of the C-17 Indian Air Force aircraft in Kabul, and then of course the Indian diplomats were evacuated. So this is an ongoing process, and it is of course a necessity for the Americans to make sure that their forces remain there, especially at the Kabul airport, because across the country there is almost no presence of American soldiers now. The only place where there is a good number of American soldiers present is the Kabul airport, and from the Kabul airport the focus is for the evacuation. Once the evacuation is done, it is given that the Americans will leave the country. But the big question is how long the evacuation process will continue. In fact, yesterday the Indian External Affairs Minister, he is right now in fact in United States, and of course he addressed the United Nations Security Council as well. After his meeting at the United Nations Security Council, he had addressed the press, and during his address to the press he talked about Afghanistan. This is the first statement by the Indian External Affairs Minister after the fall of Kabul, and he specifically mentioned that our biggest focus is to make sure that the Indian nationals who are stuck in the country, they are brought back to India. Approximately 1,500 Indian nationals are still in Afghanistan, and India is getting number of requests even as we speak.
Right, Siddhant, thank you so much for all your inputs, and thank you for joining us on WION. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.